And now let's turn our attention to the West African nation of Niger. The coup leaders are still in power, for now at least. They've been issued an ultimatum by a bloc of West African countries. These countries have said that Niger's military junta must restore the presidency of the ousted leader, Mohamed Bazoum. Either that or risk a military intervention. These countries will intervene militarily. That's what they've said. The deadline they've set is of Sunday. But it seems that the junta has no intention of stepping down. They're already issuing decrees and scrapping decade-old agreements. The target of their ire seems to be France. France once colonized Niger. There's been an outpouring of anger against France recently. Supporters of the coup have blamed France for the poor conditions in their country. And it's likely that the junta will continue to paint Paris as the villain, which throws up the question, what happens to France's interests in this country, in Niger, especially its supply of uranium to power its nuclear reactors? You see, France relies on nuclear power for 70% of its electricity production, and Niger is one of its biggest suppliers of this nuclear fuel. So will the coup in Niger lead to blackouts in France? Here's a report.
Last week, a coup took place in the West African nation of Niger. And it does have its supporters. Hundreds of them have been taking to the streets of the capital, Niamey. Ask them why they support the coup, and you'll find a common theme in their answers.
The world must understand that Africa's misfortune is France, the authorities, because the French are citizens like us, so we can't hate them. But we hate their authorities because they've done too much harm to our country, and really, enough is enough.
We have uranium, we have diamonds, we have gold, we have oil, and we live like slaves. Why should we? Until when? We can't accept it. The French base in Niger must leave. We don't need the French to keep us safe.
There have been attacks on the French embassy in Niger's capital. The French troops stationed in Niger are being asked to go home. And supporters of the coup have been vocally opposing France. The military junta has also been ramping up the anti-French rhetoric.
In view of France's casual attitude and reaction to the internal situation prevailing in our country, the National Council for Safeguarding the Homeland has decided to denounce France's security and defense cooperation agreements.
5 military deals have been revoked. These deals were signed decades ago, between 1977 and 2020. So, to revoke them clearly sends a message that Niger's new junta considers France the enemy. And that could be a good strategy to get public support. France and Niger share a troubled history. Niger was a French colony till 1960. So were a lot of other West African nations: Mauritania, Senegal, Mali, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Benin. All these nations were part of what was once called French West Africa. And no matter what tone-deaf justifications the former colonizers give, colonization always leads to the exploitation of the colonies. There's a reason Niger was one of the poorest nations in the world even before the coup. This is a country rich in natural resources: uranium, gold and oil, like one of the demonstrators mentioned earlier. But it was still considered one of the poorest nations in the world, because it has been in a situation that most former colonies face: an unequal power dynamic with its former colonizer. Some critics call it neo-colonization. Raw materials like uranium from Niger go to a former colonizer like France. It is used to fuel French nuclear power plants. The French energy sector benefits, sells its electricity abroad, generates billions, and then gives some of the money back to Niger as aid. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This actually happens. France generates around $3.3 billion a year selling electricity. Meanwhile, Niger, which supplies about 18% of France's and 5% of the world's uranium, remains poor. You can imagine that it would frustrate the people there. Niger's uranium is just one example. There are other resources and raw materials in all the former colonies that continue to get exploited. And it could explain the anti-French sentiment in the other coup-hit nations in the region. like Mali and Burkina Faso. It's an existing wound, a festering injustice, and military juntas can easily tap into this negative sentiment to become popular among the people. But then what? If Niger stops sending uranium to France and Europe, the colonizers will still survive.
Economic and trade relations between Niger and France are extremely tenuous. Of course, people always think of uranium when they talk about Niger, but over the last 10 years, it appears that Niger is France's fifth largest supplier of uranium. So it is no longer the strategic partner for uranium that it may have been in the 60s, 70s and the 80s.
EU utilities have sufficient inventories of natural uranium to mitigate any short-term supply risks, and for the medium and long term there are enough deposits on the world market to cover the EU needs. That is something that we have ascertained.
Finding new partners takes time. Time that the fragile West African economies may not have. And the military junta isn't likely to have the best economic minds available. So Niger needs to think carefully. Is it worth risking a complete collapse just to vent against its former colonizer? And France needs to do better as well. Whatever outreach Macron has undertaken through the years has clearly failed to sway Niger. France needs to acknowledge its failures in West Africa, and it needs to become